1967 and 1968 tied to Jerusalem recaptured by Israel.
The 6-Day War. Isn't that amazing, Gary?
Well, that's more than amazing. Now, what we have here, and don't be confused, this is really simpler than it sounds. The Lord seems to be marking dates with signs. And now, Mark talked about signs a minute ago. And in a moment, I'm going to turn him loose and let him talk about watching for the coming of the Lord, because he's got a lot to say about that. But Mark, let's just review. The Lord seems to be like pointing a finger at significant dates, and you think you've found a pattern. Tell us about the pattern.
Well, as far as the pattern, what's significant to me is that even before 1967, the next time that you had 4 blood red moons again was right after Israel became a nation in 48.
Wow.
It happened again in 1949 and 1950.
And we're talking about on Passover
on Passover and Sukkot.
And Sukkot.
Wow.
And then you didn't have any astronomical tetrads in the 1800s, the 1700s, the 1600s. In the 1500s, there were 6, but none of those fell on Passover and Sukkot. The next time it fell again on Passover and Sukkot, if you remember in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, on the 9th of Av, a very significant date in Jewish history, when all the Jews were kicked out of Spain, it was 1493 and 1494 when you had these blood red moons.
On Passover.
On Passover and Sukkot. So each time they happened, it was tied to the Jewish people.
And I feel like interjecting here, because Passover is the first of the 7 feasts of Israel. Sukkot is the 7th of the 7 feasts of Israel. JR, what we have here is like a parenthesis around the beginning and the end of the festival cycle, and at each point it's marked by a distinct astronomical occurrence. Now, that's a sign. That's
amazing, isn't it? Now, if you're getting confused with all of this talk, I want you to know it's going to be in our May magazine. Be sure and get the May edition of Prophecy in the News magazine, and you'll be able to read all about this. Not only that, but in the May magazine, I have an article on the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn throughout the past 6,000 years of human history. 303 conjunctions, 36 of them were triple conjunctions, and I'll tell you all about how they fit the biblical, historical events. And so these 2 articles on the heavenly signs are going to be something you'll want to keep. You'll want to read over and over and study. So call the phone number at the bottom of your screen and order our magazine today. Will you do that? Just ask for the May 2008 edition of Prophecy in the News magazine. Now, I would like for you to subscribe for a whole year. It would be worth your while to get it, because month after month we come up with these new discoveries in prophetic studies. And so I want you to get the magazine. For $34.95, we'll send you the magazine and 4 free books. That would be Guardians of the Grail and The Men Who Plan to Rule the World, Hidden Prophecies in the Song of Moses, The Mystery of the Menorah and the Hebrew Alphabet, and finally, They Pierced the Veil and Saw the Future, our study of the 12 minor prophets. Now, these 4 books cost in bookstores about $12 each, a $48 value. For $34.95, we'll send you this for the next year, and we'll even send you those books, and we'll take care of the postage. So $34.95, not a penny more. That's all we need. Just call the phone number at the bottom of your screen and order Prophecy in the News magazine today. Gary, let's hear some scriptures on when the sun turns dark and the moon turns to blood. What does Jesus have to say about
Well, Jesus in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, was talking to the disciples, and he made this statement. He said, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light." And at that point, and let me just stop, when we think of the sun being darkened, the moon not giving her light, we usually think of some astronomical catastrophe, perhaps the sun sputtering and the moon being affected by all this. But maybe it's time to rethink this a little bit and think of it as a natural cycle, the cycle of the eclipses. And this is exactly what you've done, Mark.
Well, according to Mark here, we have when Israel was born in 1948, these 4 blood moons in Passover and Sukkot. And in 1967, when Jerusalem was taken and liberated, the Temple Mount liberated, we had the 4 blood moons. This has got to be a pattern. So when we have at the end of this coming sabbatical cycle in the year 2014, 2015, in the sabbatical year, that's at the 7th year of the cycle, we have these 4 blood moons. It's just phenomenal.
Well, what's amazing to me is when I saw that, I thought, well, hey, now wait a minute. Scripture, it's not in error. I got to look, and is there any solar eclipses? Because it said that the sun would turn dark. Okay. So I went to NASA's website and looked at the solar eclipses. And sure enough, there's a solar eclipse on the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah. Wow. And then I went back, and there's a total solar eclipse on Adar 29 and Nisan 1. Right in there, that date. And the reason why that's so significant is because Nisan 1 is the beginning of the religious calendar, Passover 2 weeks later.
Yes.
And Nisan 1 is when Moses set up the tabernacle. That's when the glory of God fell. And so Adar 29 is an ending of the religious calendar, kind of like a new season. And so on Adar 29, leading into Nisan 1, you have a total solar eclipse beginning the religious year.
Okay, let's look at it on the screen here. We have the total solar eclipses on Nisan 1.
Yes.
Or on Adar 29, Nisan 1. Actually, Nisan 1 begins at sundown. Right. Adar 29 is during the day.
Yes.
And the sun we have to be able to see it, so it has to happen during the daytime. And then, of course, the following Tishri 1, 2015, 6 months later. And, that Tishri 1 there is Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year.
Yes.
And there is a solar eclipse. Now, that solar eclipse is not a total solar eclipse. It's a partial eclipse. Nevertheless, it's still of astronomical significance. But I want you to notice here, I've had this animation running, and we see what it looks like in a total solar eclipse. You see the corona around the moon there that's sitting directly over the sun. Now this we're going to see in 2015 on the first day of the first month, and again on the first day of the 7th month, which is the Jewish New Year. And that concludes, it is Tishri 1 that concludes the sabbatical year.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. And so and
it's time for the Messiah to show up, right?
Yes. Well, to think you have the religious year beginning with the total solar eclipse, 2 weeks later, a total lunar eclipse on Passover, and then a civil year beginning with the solar eclipse, followed 2 weeks later by another total blood red moon on the Feast of Sukkot, all in 2015.
Well, now, if you think that this is a coincidence, I want you to know that it's timed. You can go into a computer astronomy program and go back in history and forward in history, and there are no more of these for the rest of the century.
That's right. It doesn't happen again. It does not happen again on the biblical holidays.
Now, there are 3 more solar eclipses that you need to know about. And one of them happens this year. Tell us about them.
Well, yeah, what's fascinating is, as Gary read, if these events happen, it says in Matthew and in Luke, at the end of the tribulation, and if that's 2015, you back off 7 years, that puts 2008 as a very critical year.
Yes.
And beginning this year, there's a total solar eclipse, only one. Next year, there's only one. And the next year, there's only one. But they all fall like a bullseye right on the 1st of Av, or the 29th of Tammuz. Yes. And for the Christians, many aren't aware of the significance of that date because we haven't been watching the biblical calendar. But the 17th of Tammuz is when they worshiped the golden calf.
Yes.
It's also when Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls
of Jerusalem.
Wow. And by the way, it's also the same day the Lebanon War started 2 years ago. The missiles went through the northern border of Israel the same day Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls.
Yes. Well, Mark, I have to just, this is exciting, folks. This is amazing. The thing that grabs me as you're talking about this is the very simple fact that Av is called the dark time in the Hebrew calendar.
Yes.
In fact, there is a period of 3 weeks during that time.